Hello, I'm Kimberley Dondo, Digital Content Manager, and welcome to In Conversation With, the podcast series that delves into the world of financial services and brings you face to face with some of the most notable figures in the industry. Listen as we discuss topics that are currently facing the industry and hear from visionary CEOs to disruptive innovators as we bring you a diverse array of voices and perspectives. We'll explore the challenges they faced, the lessons they've learned, and the insights they have to share about the ever-evolving landscape of financial services. Hello and welcome to In Conversation With. I'm Kimberley Dondo, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Sebastian and Anna from Vanguard. Thank you both for joining me today.
Hi, Kimberley.
Hi. So I'm going to start with you, Sebastian. Could you introduce yourself a bit more and let us know about your role at Vanguard and how you got started in the industry?
Yes, thank you, Kimberley. I started at Vanguard in January 2024. Before that, I spent 23 years on the sell side at Morgan Stanley and Sanford Bernstein in New York and in London. The team I joined at Vanguard is called the Advisory Research Center. Most of what Vanguard does in Europe is on behalf of advisors and intermediaries, and I spend some time looking at all the great work we do out of the US, but also Australia, and try to either localize that, make it relevant for a British audience or a German audience, and then bring it to people's attention. And obviously that's why we're here today, because Anna and her team put together this terrific piece on cognitive decline, and we felt that was something relevant in the UK and of course everywhere in the world that was sort of independent of pure finance and the things that are regulatory, which we might touch upon today.
Okay, and Anna?
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me. I'm Anna Madamba. I work with the investment strategy group at Vanguard. We'd like to think of ourselves as an interdisciplinary think tank. So it's comprised of several groups. There are groups that look into how investors should be behaving in terms of what are optimal asset allocations or spending strategies. Our group looks more into what investors are doing and why, and essentially try to provide that bridge between what they're currently doing and how to get them towards what they should be behaving in terms of optimal financial behavior.
Okay, fantastic. So as Sebastian mentioned earlier, we're going to be talking about cognitive decline in clients. So let's start with the basics. What are some early warning signs of cognitive decline that advisors should be aware of in their clients? And are there subtle changes in behavior or decision-making that might raise red flags? I don't know who wants to start with that one.
I'll take that. When you talk to experts, they have an acronym for this early signs. They call it MMDT, which is essentially early manifestations of decline come in what they call money, medicine, driving, and technology. So whether that means you're not managing your finances well, you're not taking your medication, or you forget to take your medication, getting into small traffic accidents, and then just in general not having a harder time keeping up to speed with technology. Those are sort of like the early signs. And then, of course, there's always financial fraud. So, when these things happen more often than is normal, then you start suspecting whether a decline might be a cause.
Mm-hmm. Sebastian, did you have anything to add to that one?
Interestingly, in the US, I know we have a very big system there where investors call in and have discussions with advisors or with our network. And there we have technology that looks for words such as confusion or dementia. So you can do things at scale, and then you've got the very personal things that Anna was just referring to, which is really being on top of the individual relationship when someone is missing something. There's also, in the UK, we have this deadline, right, for contributing to things like ISAs. People who've never missed that deadline, and oh my goodness, this year they missed it. So it's so heterogeneous, the way that cognitive decline is measured. It's actually one of the problems here, which is that there's no easy standard way to think about it. Although Anna's done some work around this, there are tests and ways that you can measure things, but it's a long process.
Yeah. And Anna, you did mention the potential for fraud and substantial wealth losses due to unaddressed cognitive decline. So can you provide some real world examples of how this can happen? I know there's a lot of phishing things out there. I may have almost fallen for one. But what are the most common financial vulnerabilities for those experiencing cognitive impairment?
Well, we'll start with fraud. That's the one that's most well known, and there are just lots of different kinds of fraud. There's grandparent fraud. Personal family experience with it. There's romantic fraud. A lot of the impetus for some of this is this sense of urgency. Your grandson was in an accident, needs money, send it now. The ones that are increasingly getting common are more account related. For example, Amazon calling that your password was compromised, give it to me and we will reset it, and that kind of thing. It seems so legitimate, but yet at the same time, so you fall for it, but easily it becomes fraud. Or there would be what they call governmental, so some kind of authority, whether it's the IRS in the US or the Social Security Administration, saying your benefit checks will be late if you don't give us X, Y, or Z about your account, and then before you know it, they've taken over your account. But other than fraud, other examples would be like Sebastian was saying, something that's outside of your normal financial behavior. So if you've never had late fees before, and suddenly now you're getting penalties for being late in paying whatever utility, for example, and happens more often. If it happens often enough, once in a while we do forget, but if it happens often enough, then that becomes an indication, right? And what are the consequences? So not only late fees, but your service may be cut off, and so that is another set of costs to get it reinstalled and what have you. Other examples are in the US, and there's this thing we call required minimum distribution. So people enjoy tax deferred growth, but at a certain age, the government wants to start getting the benefits back, and so you're required to take some from your tax deferred savings, start withdrawing from them. And if you miss doing that, then you get penalized, and it's quite a hefty penalty. And so, as you get older, as Sebastian was saying, you forget that deadline, and then you have to pay that penalty, and it's quite consequential. The other thing too is you miss payments, your credit score suffers, and then a lot of the implications of that would be greater costs. Other examples would be not investing the way that you normally would. So maybe you're being too aggressive given your life stage. And that is because that's always the way you've been investing, but you haven't adjusted because, you haven't been checking, or you haven't had, the capacity to recognize that it's time to do that. Sometimes it's the other way around, that, somebody becomes named as an, trusted contact or executor, and they think that they will inherit that account anyway, so they start investing more aggressively based on their life stage rather than that of whoever owns the account. So lots of different examples by which cognitive decline can impact investments.
Yeah. And Sebastian?
Yeah, I would say two things that are useful in Anna's research. One is that, of course, the sums of money held by older generations, again, cognitive decline can happen at any age, but it is mostly associated with age. We did some work on what we call the Great Wealth Transfer, and in the UK, the baby boomers, that's sort of 1946 to 1964, they're about 22.5% of the population, but they control more than 50% of the UK's wealth.
Yeah.
property, and lots of reasons why that's been the case, the power of compounding and time. But what it also means is if you've got a higher concentration of wealth, you're vulnerable. And obviously the FCA thinks about this a lot. It has specific vulnerability policies and attempts to regulate this, but then you have less time to catch up. That's one of the sad things here, is that the people are vulnerable. And then there's these financial mistakes, some of them fraud and more nefarious, but some of them simple, right? Forgetting to invest or missing a deadline, and you just have less time to catch up. So I think the research, which is sort of proprietary to Vanguard, because we've got this panel that they put together from the US, I think is applicable to the UK in so many ways. You know, I've just been reading about the Dementia Research Institute in the UK, but we are years away, or not too far, but a few years away now from a simple blood test that would tell us kind of the brain score, right, which is the dream of being able to diagnose like cholesterol or something of that type. So I'm not a medic, but when you read about it, we're not there yet to have a simple number to tell people they're vulnerable. And it's that complexity that makes this such a difficult topic for advisors who we deal with in the UK. You know, they're doing their best, but it's a really hard thing to measure and to deal with client by client.
Yeah. I can imagine it would be difficult because it's not necessarily the advisor's responsibility to be looking at what would be a medical issue. And I assume it's like family and friends, and then maybe the advisor is potentially the last to know, but realistically should be looped in quite early because, again, it has to deal with their finances and what care they might need moving forward. But I wondered about different age groups. Is there a difference in how different age groups approach the topic of cognitive decline? Are younger clients more open to discussing planning for the potential impairment, or is there still a stigma attached to this issue across the board?
That's an interesting question, primarily because life expectancy has improved, and so the incidence of decline has increased, even if the prevalence of decline has increased, even if the incidence has gone down, just because we have more and more older people. And accompanying that is the realization the younger generation are seeing more and more people suffering from this. So the awareness is sort of increasing. So there is more awareness and acceptance that it's possible. But what we find from the research is that they still attribute it to the most serious kind of cognitive decline, which is dementia. So we asked about what they think their risk of cognitive decline is. Those who have experience with family members or friends who actually had decline are more aware of it, and as a result are more open to planning for it because they are, in sort of hands-on in dealing with the issue. The problem is the broader population who may not have that direct experience, and so expanding that awareness is necessary in order to have them start considering it. And one of the major sources of awareness would be a financial advisor introducing it to the conversation, because otherwise, without direct experience, for the most part, people don't pay attention. It's too far off for people to pay attention to it.
Sebastian?
Yeah, in the UK, I was talking to someone who was an advisor for 12 years who works in the Advisory Research Centre team. And he was telling me that one of the ways this is dealt with is advice firms have a vulnerability policy.
Yeah.
They come in all sorts of different flavors, but one of them can be age-based. And he said occasionally that would really annoy the client, some extremely fit, strong 70-year-old woman who doesn't.
Nothing will ever happen to me.
And that would irritate her. But what was interesting about it is it gave an excuse to say, well, we have this policy. I'm so sorry. We're just going to have to ask you these questions, go through this formula, etc. And that in itself destigmatizes. It's not you, it's this policy thing that I've got to fill out and I've got to do it. And I'm going to do it every year. So get used to it. And I think that really can be a powerful way of taking away the sense of subjectivity. I don't like what I'm hearing, etc. And, we just have this rule and it works really well. And it's linked, of course, to the FCA's vulnerable clients policy. Vulnerability is slightly different to cognitive decline. It's a more broad term, but I think again, you can almost blame the rules, and that means you can engage in a very calm, unemotional way. And then, of course, it comes to the warning signs, the issues, setting up LPAs, and all the other things. And that's true in the US and in the UK in terms of how you try and destigmatize and lower the temperature around what's something that can be quite emotional.
Yeah. I can only think of like personal experience. Well, from like my experience, my mom, for example, she might sometimes forget a password or something like that, something simple like that. And she'll get really annoyed if I try and come in like the savior or something, or just try and like teach her. It's almost like our roles are reversed and she's not comfortable with that. Looking at someone younger than you talking to you about these things can be quite, it can make you feel like someone's being condescending, but they're really trying to help you. But yeah, if you're able to put it and just be like, I know this is so irritating, but it's one of the rules. Let's just get it over and done with. I think it'll take away that feeling of like, oh, I'm being talked down to.
Well, they get, if I may, they get really defensive because of that feeling of vulnerability, especially if they are already at that stage. That's why it's important to be able to introduce the topic when they are still off sound mind, and sort of couch it in a way that we're preparing for the possibility of this, but you are in control. These are decisions that you're making for your future self in a way, right? So that it becomes less defensive because you're not vulnerable at that time. So doing it early and doing it as part of a routine planning process becomes just a checklist thing. To Seb's point, it is regulation, or for an advisor, it may be, it's part of our regular, financial health check. Do we have guardrails for if issues like this happen? Do you have we call them an agent who we can talk to in case of there is issues with cognitive decline? Has that agent changed? So from the one you named last year, from the one you named 5 years ago. So again, it becomes all part of a routine checklist. It becomes less emotional, more rational. It establishes control for the person rather than vulnerability.
Yeah. And how can advisors proactively raise the issue of cognitive decline with clients in a sensitive and respectful manner? I know, Sebastian, you just pointed out one way, but are there any resources or tools that they can facilitate to start these conversations?
Like that checklist example would be one of them. Make it part of the obligatory things that we need to talk about. But I think ahead of that is making the connection with your client, being able to establish a relationship that transparency and candidness is acceptable. Because one way or the other, if somebody's going that trajectory of cognitive decline, it will get to a point when conversations become sensitive, right? So to the extent that you could have this back and forth, that you're trusted and the client can be vulnerable with you, then that just makes the conversation easier. But absent that, setting up the guardrails, setting up this annual or whatever frequency conversation about checklist items, they all act to help sort of establish ways by which the client is protected from the start.
And Sebastian, do you have anything else to add?
I think that this idea of evidence-based and sort of goals-based financial advice. I mean, advisors, when they meet their clients, I think the minimum is once a year. That's kind of in the rules. But of course, many of the best advisors find time to meet their clients more frequently than that. and make the time and talk to the whole family, right? Sometimes they'll have multiple relationships inside a family, which can help. I think very strong note taking can be very important, because you can document the last discussion we had. You said this, you're now saying that, whatever difference may be. And if that difference is really off, that may be a time for a bigger conversation with the agent. I think in the UK, the trusted contact is something that people call this as well. I thought in Anna's paper, there's some quite sad sort of, it's a very quantitative paper, there's thousands of respondents, but I think there's also some quotes in there, Anna, that show the sort of sadness of people who are not sure what to do. And I think
who to name.
Please go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. I mean, not only what to do, but who to name. Some people assume that, family or friends would be their trusted contact, that there would be somebody who would take the reins in the event that they couldn't. The sad thing is some people cannot name anybody. And what happens in those kinds of cases? There are times when even financial advisors are named as their agent. And so it really depends on what the different situations are. But, the realization that even if you have family, that they are able and willing and available to take on the reins when you can't, I don't think is an assumption that people should be making. It has to be discussed, and it has to be known that people are willing to take on that role. Sometimes you might have your, favorite child, or maybe that child was the one who was taking care of you, and that child can take offense if you decide that, that person was so good. That child is so good at taking care of me, knows what I need, but it's not financially savvy. I need to lean on the other child who's more financially savvy to take on that part. So whether that introduces friction or not, again, putting things out in the open and discussed when the situation is not dire yet would be the best outcome for people in preparation for decline.
Yeah, definitely. You don't want your family fighting it out when you really need them the most.
Yeah. And the worst thing is they cannot ask you anymore what your preferences are. So that's why it's important that you address it well. You can actually take control of how things are managed.
Yeah. Sebastian?
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing. In Anna's research, there's also looking at cognitive decline rather than dementia, right, which is one of the more sort of severe form. I think what we see as well is that there are things that a financial advisor is very well placed to help with. The big plans, the estate plan, the inheritance plans, as we would call them in the UK, and the big decisions. But often far earlier than that, there is a need for who's going to pay the bills, who's going to set up the online food delivery because the person is no longer maybe, able to take on the burden of going to the shop. So there's lots of things here. And as families have generally gotten smaller, certainly in the West, there's fewer cousins and brothers and sisters and children, and there's just fewer people who can assume that role. So I know, Anna, from listening to prior conversations, that you have a large extended family, but you also need people younger than you to help, right? Because it's not much help if everyone helping you is exactly the same age. Yeah. So there's a lot of complexity here. This is so heterogeneous. It's not just a simple thing to do once. There are many, many complications. Taking people's driving license away essentially is one of often the big stressful moments, because of course that can be the first warning, as Anna said, with MMD, right? The D was the driving.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. So Anna, maybe that's something worth touching on in terms of the research and also how you see things.
Well, the other thing I was going to add to this is not only do we have smaller families or a smaller circle of people to rely on, they may not be local to where the client is. And this is a big thing too. It's like, you could have a daughter, several states away who's willing to help, but
or
it's
in
just
another country.
Or in the other country, true. But it's just not available. So how do you now manage the logistics of, like Seb was saying, providing for food, providing for travel to the doctor's appointments, paying bills, picking up mail, and that kind of thing. I mean, it's not just like directly finances; it's day-to-day living as well, and that's all part and parcel of having to prepare for the risk of cognitive decline.
Yeah. And are there practical steps that people can take to prepare, including legal documents, like what legal documents and financial safeguards, or even lifestyle changes?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd like to say, prevention is always, tops, the key part of it. Some have genetic predispositions, but, absent that, there are lifestyle changes that we've seen in the medical literature that does help. So whether it is, healthy diet, sleeping properly, exercise, those are all have been found over and over again to try to improve your risk of decline. But on top of that, whether it's a will or more importantly, a living will, in terms of who is going to make decisions on your behalf if you're incapacitated, there are trust documents that could be made in order to prepare for that kind of thing. And then there are, in the U.S., there's long-term care insurance for those, somewhere in the middle who needs to be insured for that. Some people either qualify for care in the lower end of the income range, but some people can self-finance their long-term care. So for those who are sort of like in the middle and need to insure against it, then consideration of long-term care insurance might be the other another thing. And then there are, other ways like automating payments, for example, so that you don't miss, those late fees.
Yeah.
And we talked about, certain guardrails, if it means, hiring, setting, what do you call that, thresholds for how much you can withdraw at one time, or how frequent in a month that you can withdraw from your accounts. It sort of protects you from those kinds of things.
So next, we talked about family members earlier, but we talked about them in terms of them potentially squabbling. I did say earlier that family members are also probably the first people to notice any signs of cognitive decline. So how can advisors best support families who are concerned about a loved one's financial well-being? And how can advisors navigate potential conflicts or disagreements within families?
I think I'd start with perhaps correcting / considering a different scenario. With more and more elderly households are people living by themselves, call it solo agers, for example. So there's nobody there to notice, the differences, right? But family members do notice. I'd like to say advisors also notice, to the extent that they meet up with their clients more often, sometimes even more often than family, sad to say, right? So again, back to heterogeneity, right? There's so many different situations for which we just have to recognize that family / other professionals would be the first people to notice decline, sometimes more than the person itself. Himself or herself. So in instances like this, how can advisors help? So for one, I mean, they are another set of eyes in terms of recognizing whether decline is happening or not, right? But secondly, engage with whoever the trusted contact is. Like, for more often than not, we as an advisors would engage with the client and maybe the immediate household, like the spouse or the partner. but more often than not, the trusted contact or the agent is a generation lower, like the children. And so establishing that connection with the next generation, establishing the connection with that trusted agent becomes important because, again, you establish that familiarity during the good times, so that when the bad times happen, it's already there, right? The rapport, the conversations, the trust has already been established, so that you're more focused on dealing with what's in front of you, rather than having to do both at the same time when it's already sort of like an emergency.
Yeah.
So establishing that connection with the other generation or the agent. Another thing too is, and this is getting more and more common, having to think about what expanded role an advisor might need to have, right?
Yeah.
Because you become part of that support group for the client when we talk about healthcare, finances, legal needs, and then your day-to-day needs. You're part of this professional core group that's supporting the client. And so how does that evolve an advisory business? Do you get into that and have like a section of the practice that's focused on that, or are you prepared to engage with whomever is in charge of this core team, because more and more they're going to lean on you for the financial part, right? In order to coordinate all of the needs of this one client. So how are we prepared to sort of address that?
Yeah.
I think one of the simple ways, it seems like a first step that an advisor can take as part of that ongoing relationship, but one of the things is consolidating accounts. I think we're all guilty of this. When you're sort of going through your financial life, you add things because there's an offer or there's something interesting, or and that can lead to a sort of proliferation of accounts. I mean, the UK government has a dormant. It's a great name, a dormant asset scheme.
Okay.
Literally money that just sits there because no one knows who is from. Now, this is slightly different, but it just tells you that people don't always track what they've got where.
Yeah.
And as a result, I think just it can be a simple step. It's not dramatic or radical, but saying to someone, oh, you have this bank account, you don't really use it, and you've had it for 20 years. Why don't we shut that and just keep everything in a slightly simpler place? And I think that reduction of paperwork can be helpful as part of an ongoing sort of financial advice service. So I think some of that, it could just be this sort of bookkeeping of where everything is, and bringing things to make them simpler. That I think is an easy, everything sounds easy when we talk about it on a podcast. Of course, these are human relationships. You got to get the forms signed out. That's difficult. The actual jobs these advisors do is hard. But I think conceptually that's one way, kind of on the path to simplification for a client who potentially could become vulnerable down the line.
And earlier we were talking about fraud and the nasty way that people can lose their money. So what specific advice would you give to advisors in protecting their vulnerable clients from scams or undue influence? Like I said earlier, even I almost fell for one like a month ago, and I was surprised. And actually, one of my colleagues was saying that her mother-in-law had received a text message similar to the one that you mentioned, Anna, the one where it's like, I have been in an accident, like it was from her, and she needed £3,000 immediately. And normally for me, that would raise a red flag. Like, why are you texting me that you need £3,000 because you got in an accident? But instead, her mother-in-law was like, oh, well, I'm out right now. I need to go and talk to father-in-law about this. And luckily he was able to ring and check, and then they were able to stop. But that just goes to show how quickly they might have, sent over the money. What ways can you protect those vulnerable clients?
So there are fraud tracking services where they look at transactional behavior and see whether they set up algorithms where red flags are raised when there is unusual behavior. Call it a huge withdrawal, for example.
Yeah.
But even that, with different financial institutions, when people call to withdraw a huge amount, for example, they are on the lookout for flags or for indications that might need additional probing in terms of like, why are you doing so and so? And there's regulation in the US that allows them, for example, to delay distribution of, for example, a withdrawal if there is suspected fraud. So like in phone centers, people are trained to try to inquire deeper if there are instances that seems to be like sometimes it's background noise. If you hear somebody coaching the person who's calling you, that kind of thing. Others are, just actual transactional behavior and then trying to look for red flags around them. And then sometimes it is, family that raises the issue and tells them to sort of establish blocks or thresholds that if my father, withdraws anything more than the normal $10,000 a month, you need to call me or something, that kind of thing. But, those kinds of guardrails that are in place does help with sort of stemming this. And then the other one is obviously awareness. More and more, if people are aware of these kinds of scams, which was the case with the family member I was referring to. She was called the grandson. They knew the name of the grandson too.
Yeah.
Was in a car accident, and this, I don't know whether it was the police or the hospital who was calling her, but needed it as a deposit or something. And she called her son and asked, "Is the grandson okay?" And he goes, "Yeah." But they knew where the grandson lived, which was a different state than the person called, and they knew the name of that grandson. So it's getting to be more personal. And so to the extent that they are aware of these kinds of scams, then maybe the antenna goes up, right? And then they start thinking twice. If they are made aware of the different ways by which they could be scammed.
Yeah. And Seb?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the subject of scams, I mean, I think it's the banks in the United Kingdom deserve some credit because they have set up what I would call systematic circuit breakers. And then I think where we sit in the asset management industry is more of a human circuit breaker, sort of changing your will to someone this person had never mentioned before. That's a much more serious, large piece of planning where the advisor is likely to kind of step in and then bring in other family members, and then there can be a proper discussion. I think the systematic circuit breakers, the banks are more affected by this, right? Because they have to pay for a lot of fraud. And so they've done a lot of education. They've sent, and if you try and pay for certain things, they say, do you know who this is? Are you sure? Etc. Which, of course, when you are sure is an irritation. But
it's very annoying.
But it does create, again, a moment of pause. And so I think, and as Anna was saying, in the call centers where they deal with enormous volumes of phone calls, I think they've done by and large a pretty good job, actually. In the UK, there's been widely publicized schemes. There's a sort of pooled scheme when something goes wrong and the losses are kind of covered. So I would say the banks have done a pretty good job. But on our side of asset management, it's more of a human circuit breaker with some guardrails around the other things we talked about. Have the bills been paid? Is something going wrong? Should we look at that? But this is where a relationship between the advisor and the client is so important for the bigger decisions. As I said, we've done all this work on wealth transfer. The UK has something called testamentary freedom, right? Which is you can, decide to leave your fortune to whoever you wish. And that's different in France and places like that, where we have something called forced heirship, where you have to give most of your money to descendants, and then you have some part of discretion. So again, that creates its own, we love freedom. Freedom's great, but of course it can create these scenarios in which, if someone has, rewrites their will against their will, literally. So I think there's a lot of ability for both technology and then the human factor. And that's why advice is so valuable. I mean, it's stepping in and stopping really bad mistakes is, we tried to quantify it in Anna's research. It might be worth sort of explaining how we came to this very large number, but it's a seriously difficult thing because, of course, any research dealing with hypotheticals is, can be difficult to prove exactly, but I think it's still worth doing. And that's why, 3 years ago, we published this, and I think it's still relevant today.
Yeah, definitely. And Seb, you were talking a bit earlier about technology that you guys have in place to look at different factors. So what other technology solutions or innovations are there that can help advisors and families better manage the financial affairs of their clients experiencing cognitive decline?
Yeah, I think it's the tripwires on the calls. That's a big one, because artificial intelligence, that's the buzzword of the moment, but essentially it's just inferring and listening and hearing for certain patterns of speech or certain words. In the financial industry, if you write an email with the word guarantee on it, I can assure you, having worked in other businesses, that's going to get caught. So, the financial industry has lots of ways of looking through things and finding things. It's actually one of the things that finance is generally an industry that adopts technology very fast because the sums in play are large, and we spend a lot of money, Vanguard included, on just protecting what we, this very, very serious, because we're a fiduciary. It's not our money. It's the client's money. So we have to protect it. So there's a lot of intelligence around that. I think Anna probably has interesting perspectives, from her research and from the US of sort of, the future of tech and what we're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, so other than AI and the tracking of unusual activities, other things to consider would be, technology that allows family members to call monitor accounts, right? With permission, obviously, but being able to make sure that somebody else is looking out for you and making sure that bills are paid or that there's nothing unusual. So whatever technology allows that co-management would be one of them. And of course, alerts about unpaid bills, like utility companies sometimes have that. I'll give you the ability to name somebody else who should be getting the bill, just so that they know, or they could be informed if the bill has not been paid yet. The other one would be, I spoke about this ecosystem of support, whether it's healthcare, finances, legal, and caregiving, really. But some kind of a platform that allows for that conversation. It could be a Teams call, but it could be something more elaborate than that, where like a regular check-in among these different professional groups in the spirit of protecting the client would be enabled. So, technology not only in financial monitoring, but in allowing the collaboration of different parties in order to support the client would be important.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of that ecosystem, of knowing that there's a bunch of people looking over me.
Sure. and facilitating and facilitating the thing that needs to be done. So it could be done, more faster than normally would. You wouldn't be in the business of tracking down who this particular person I need to contact would be when you're in the middle of the issue or the situation, right?
Yeah, it will definitely make it a lot of a faster process if you're able to catch things sooner and keep everyone informed who needs to be informed.
Yeah.
And finally, looking ahead to the future, what trends or challenges do you foresee in this area, and how can the financial advice profession better prepare itself to support clients through cognitive decline?
So I mentioned this earlier, like for a financial advisory practice, the decision whether to expand to have like an expert in senior planning, or the acknowledgement that they will have to be involved in this ecosystem. It's not just about one specific part of financial planning. It is, sort of like an additional role, essentially, is to coordinate with everybody else. The other one would be in terms of whether you are an agent or not for the client, and what needs are involved in order to make you qualify for one. And then as far as regulations, there's this thing around privacy. So for example, I've heard this a number of times in terms of financial fraud. I would call I don't know, Vanguard, I want to withdraw $10,000, for example.
Right.
And their phone reps catch them. No, we're holding the disbursement. Client gets frustrated, calls the next institution. I have an account with Bank of America. I want to withdraw $10,000. But there are privacy rules in place that, in terms of sharing of, those different accounts. How do we share essentially across the different institutions in order to try to mitigate this situation? Somebody with multiple accounts can just go from one to the other, even if one institution is successful in stopping it. The other may not be as much.
Yeah. So like maybe an overall record where you can flag someone and then another institution would be able to see, there's a flag on this account.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's look more into this. That sounds like a good idea. I see why not. I don't see why not. That would be in place.
As Seb said, it's easy to talk about. It's harder to
implement. Yeah. I guess having one new body created, who's going to oversee it, who's going to chip into it. Yeah. But Sab?
Yeah, I think Anna's point's a great one. I think that's what a lot of the banks used to do, or maybe they still do on credit card fraud. There's a sort of central pool, and then they're all sharing information to make it better. It used to be a thing when you had a physical plastic card and people would swipe it and all the rest. That's slightly declined, but of course, unfortunately, new things pop up that make things difficult. I mean, I think Anna put it well in her piece. This is a holistic planning exercise. You can't do one thing without the others. You've got to have legal documents. You've got to have conversation with family members. You've got to have providers and experts in healthcare and finance. And that's why this is so difficult, because if it were easy, we'd just have a point solution. You click this button and it's done. This is so difficult. There are even someone who may experience cognitive decline may have better days and worse days.
Yeah.
What if they took the test on a good day and you don't see it? I think the ability of financial advisors to contact their clients more frequently is difficult. They've got a lot on their plates. They've got a high sort of regulatory burden. They work extremely hard already. But I think, can you make an extra 5 phone calls just to catch up with your slightly older, slightly more vulnerable clients? That's, again, very easy to say and hard to do. And then knowing what are the right questions. A lot of the big financial advice platforms know the right way to address this, know the right questions to ask. So, and again, they will have sometimes experts in gerontology on how to help and how to spot things. So we're all learning as we go along, and as of course the wealth is concentrated in that age group, and of course the silent generation, who are, I think, 1928 and above, they're obviously much older, and they are dying, and so there's just a lot happening in this field. So as I said, that's why we thought, we got this paper approved for UK and Europe, even though it's all in dollars and the rest, because these problems don't halt at the Atlantic, right?
No.
They are relevant everywhere, and even if we're talking about slightly different financial terms, it's very applicable, we felt, across Europe and the UK. So hopefully this is just part of something as we publish more on some of these issues. But on the whole, advisors want to do the right thing. It's just a question of time and allocation of that time to all the challenges they've got.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it also, with the FCA looking more into vulnerable clients, it only makes sense to make sure that you're looking at all the literature, all the research that's out there, even if it is talking about things in terms of the US, it's still applicable because it's talking about human beings. And even if we are in different countries or land masses, we're all pretty similar. So yeah, I think it makes sense. But thank you so much for speaking with me today, Sebastian, Anna. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to In Conversation With. We do hope that you enjoyed it. Please do keep up to date with all our new releases via Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you get your podcasts from. You can also keep up to date with all our new content published on the Money Marketing website, as well as our print edition Money Marketing magazine. So make sure to subscribe. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. See you next time.